2 years ago, when we started this channel, we were new to Southeast Asia, finding ourselves in a place where the cities are massive, overwhelming. So our goal was to dive in, to find the stories of the people and families and characters inside these impenetrable places. But it turns out that sometimes the city itself is the character. Welcome to Hanoi, the capital of Vietnam. This is a place holding more stories in its narrow alleys than just about anywhere else. So we're here to get to know its secrets, to fuel up on some of the world's strongest coffee and cheapest beer for a mission inside the famous Old Quarter, to try the best food, understand the local legends, and throw ourselves into 4,000 years of wild history. Hanoi is a place that can be full-on sensory overload, tough and loud and abrasive. But if you just throw yourself into the madness, well, it can be one of the most rewarding cities on the entire planet. This is our 24 hours in Hanoi. 4,000 years ago, when the oceans receded and uncovered a valley inland from the Gulf of Tonkin, a group of people settled a plot of land. They chose this place because of its natural protection, tucked between the Red and Black rivers and the Ba Vi Mountains. They would develop their own mythology based around this unique landscape, a story that told of a god who built a tall pillar to separate the earth from the sky, with the pillar built by digging a hole that would become the nearby ocean. This story would become the origin legend of what we now call Vietnam. Anyway, the settlement would grow into a fortress, hard and unforgiving, but so effective that its reputation and influence would grow, and by the 4th century BC, it would be chosen as the capital of the first Vietnamese dynasty. Over the next 2 millennia, this city, with its strategic location and growing size, would be coveted by anyone who wanted to rule the gateway to Southeast Asia. Its palace the prize of hundreds of wars, battles, sieges, and invasions. It would change hands no less than 26 times after its first construction, flying the flag of kingdoms and empires ranging from the first Chinese dynasty to the mighty Champa to the colonial French. But the city itself just kept on going, the only stronghold in Asia that the Mongol army could not destroy, fighting off Genghis Khan's horde not once but 3 times. As the centuries passed and the world changed time after time, the only constant here in this region was Hanoi, protected by the mountain gods and the toughness of its people. Its streets have seen it all, from the disciples of Confucius to maritime Silk Road traders to French colonists and the rise of Ho Chi Minh. And with each generation came a new layer added to the local culture, including, of course, the cuisine. Hanoi is a living museum, one of the only places of its kind anywhere on Earth. So let's dive in. Yeah, so this is one of those where, like, I'm gonna take a bite so that we can get that bite on camera, and then you're gonna see the camera cut because I got 2 of these and Dennis has to eat it while it's hot. This is straight out of the oven, and I'm not going to make him just sit there and let the best banh mi in Hanoi go bad because I have to take a bunch of bites of a sandwich on camera. So here's 1 bite so you can see how much I enjoy this. And then, camera, can you hear this? I'm going to put this next to my microphone as I just crumble all over myself. Can you hear this? All right, I understand that in a city with ancient traditions, starting with a banh mi is a pretty amateur choice. This is, of course, a sandwich that dates back only to the middle of the 20th century, and even though it does have local origins, by now it's more associated with other parts of Vietnam. But you can call me whatever names you want, I'm still the one who gets to eat this. A perfect banh mi is something that looks simple, but it's so technical that this shop, here since 1988, is the only place in Hanoi that does it right. You need a baguette so delicate you have to hold it tight so it doesn't float away. Slathered in pâté made with just the right texture, and all the other components, well, they're basically just garnishes, each contributing to a whole that still feels light enough that you can eat it any time. It won't ruin your appetite even on the way to breakfast. And that's good because you do want to come here early to get the bread straight from the oven. Yesterday, when I was walking around, so I visited a friend from China who's living here. And his assistant asked what I was doing here, and I said, we're here to make YouTube videos. And she said, oh, ASMR? And I said no, but maybe I have to rethink that answer. It's a pro tip that when you visit Hanoi, you should probably make a beeline straight to a place like Banh Mi Pâté first thing in the morning before you start exploring, because you're going to need all of your faculties for what comes next. Walking through Hanoi can feel like getting punched in the face by all of your senses at the same time. There's the heat and humidity, the smell of grilling meat, cigarette smoke, and motorcycle exhaust, and the overwhelming sounds of a place that's constantly in motion, set to the backdrop of dodging traffic while fighting off a hangover, because it's impossible to do Hanoi sober. Hanoi is a city that keeps you on your toes. It's fast-paced and hectic, and the local people, well, I say this with love, but this is not the land of smiles. Here, if you clog up the sidewalk checking a map or trying to get your bearings, you're going to get honked at, glared at, or sworn at in a way that might make a New Yorker blush. I guess when you've spent 4,000 years fighting off invasions, you don't feel the need to kowtow to crowds taking Instagram photos. It's not unfriendly, it's just not friendly. Either way, put it all together, and it's almost enough to make you want to turn around and go right back to bed, but you don't, because around every chaotic corner, there's some of the best food on the entire planet.
Yeah, true. Thank you.
I've been to Hanoi about a half dozen times, and almost every single day starts the same way, with a quick stop for a banh mi, a fight against the chaos and traffic, and then a local breakfast here, at my favorite street cart in the Old Quarter. Their specialty is a dish called Bun Ca, and it's a Hanoi classic. It's fish in a half dozen different forms, thrown into a bowl of stock made from pork bones seasoned with mountains of dill, taro stems, and shallots. It's aggressively sour from pickled bamboo shoots and fresh calamansi, aromatic from the use of banana blossoms and a basket of local herbs, and altogether it makes something so intense that it's served for breakfast because locals say it's a stimulant, the big flavor giving you the strength to get through a day in the madness. All right, there's no way to be authoritative about a city like Hanoi. It's all about our own experiences. And for me, those experiences are usually waking up with an extreme hangover. As Dennis and I did this morning, we were taken out for what turned into a long night of drinking local beers, as tends to happen in Hanoi. And to me, the hangover cure is this, a bowl of Bun Ca, not Bun Cha, which is the much more well-known local specialty. Bun, of course, means just noodles. Bun Ca is fish noodles, and really what it is this is just catfish. It's like fried catfish skin, catfish fritters, crispy giant chunks of catfish meat, and all of it in a catfish broth. And I am fully aware that I might even be wrong. The English translation of the Vietnamese name is catfish. It might not even be that. I'm so just out of place and overwhelmed, and I love it about Hanoi, and yeah, that's. There's so many revelations here, and one of them is this place. I adore this soup. I'm gonna be honest, ever since the first time I came here, I kind of wanted to do a video in Hanoi. Like this place sitting here in this atmosphere, in this alley with this quality of food, and a dish that nobody thinks to try, it was just like, all right, let's try to find a way to do a video here. I love what I do. The thing about Hanoi, I'm a cook. I'm not a videographer. Like, I never thought in terms of, you know, the way a video is going to look until we were a year and a half into the channel. Like, we've been doing this for 2 years now, and I'm still kind of only starting to get the hang of like thinking visually, not just in terms of like the production. But something about Hanoi, like every time I came, even before we had a channel, it's like I want to film here. Like, this is just like you could set. You know, if you see a movie that's based in Southeast Asia, it's probably filmed in Old Town Hanoi. Like, every angle, every time we turn a corner, it's just like, dude, shoot that. Like, get a picture of that. Like, it's such a cool place to walk around. And it's like, this is not a camera trick. This is what it looks like. And the whole Old Town's like this. It's, you know, even now, you look over here, it's like these ladies walking by with the bicycle carts and they're selling vegetables, walking past a place that's grilling pork for the Bun Cha. You know, Hanoi is something else. I really like this city.
The city of Hanoi today is a modern metropolis, the home to between 5 and 8 million people depending on where you draw the line. It's been built up over the centuries, sprawling across the west bank of the Red River, but right in the middle, the famous Old Town remains one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth. It's known as the 36 Streets, a grid that remains unchanged since before the year 1010. That was when the founder of Vietnam's Ly dynasty was said to have seen a dragon ascending above the Red River, telling him that Hanoi should be his capital. To this day, by the way, Hanoi is referred to in prose and poetry as Thang Long, the city of the ascending dragon. Anyway, that's just a legend, a part of Hanoi's long mythology, but if the dragon had flown high enough in the air, it would have looked down on a maze of streets that look almost exactly like it does today. The 36 alleys already well known, and some already named after products that they specialized in making or selling. There was Hang Vai, the street of fabrics, Hang Duong, or the street of sugar or sweet snacks, Hang Tung, or the street of buckets, Hang Mam, the street of fish sauce, and so on and so forth. And the wildest thing is that not only do these old streets still use those names, but many still make the same products. The Old Quarter is laid out to the north and west of Hoan Kiem Lake, itself a figure in Vietnamese mythology with its own story dating back to the early 1400s, this time not involving a dragon, but rather a golden turtle. That legend starts with the Emperor Le Loi, fresh off his heroic defense of the city against the Chinese Ming dynasty. The emperor was unwinding with a boat ride on this lake when the turtle came to the surface and asked for his magic sword, taking it with him to the bottom of the water to return it to the dragon god, where to this day it's said to remain, waiting to be returned should more invaders seek to destroy the city. Everything in Hanoi tells a story of some point in history from the distant past to the modern present, like the buildings themselves, torn down and rebuilt 200 years ago to take advantage of a tax law charging only based on street frontage, hence the almost impossibly narrow and tall designs known as tube houses. Then there's the facades added on later during the French colonial period, but again, just like the flags that used to fly over the fortress, the changes are just cosmetic. The city is what it is, and ancient beliefs, traditions, and foods draw a straight line from the past to the present.
She has one portion left, so, you know, you gotta take it.
After eating 2 breakfasts, we didn't need a morning snack, but finding this is incredibly lucky. This is an old-school version of Bun Ca, itself one of the most famous foods across the country and a staple at Vietnamese restaurants abroad. Rice paper rolls stuffed with minced pork and wood ear mushrooms, topped with a nest of fried shallots. But before Bun Ca evolved into that popular version, it started here, on the streets of Hanoi, specifically in a neighborhood known as Tan Tri. Now, that was a very long time ago, back when Tan Tri was just a small fishing community on the banks of the river, and their version was incredibly simple. Just rice paper, handmade and rolled up and dipped into a mixture of fish sauce and rice vinegar. Today, Tan Tri-style Banh Cuon is almost extinct, practically unheard of except for a few surviving vendors who still ply the streets of this one ancient city. And finding it is not just an incredible stroke of fortune, it's a reminder that a ton of the food that's now gone national began in some form right here. That's a list that includes things like pho, the beloved soup of beef stock and rice noodles, said to have been invented in a nearby village and first sold here in 1925. Cha Ca, fried fish with turmeric so connected to Hanoi that one of those 36 streets was renamed in its honor. And our breakfast, the banh mi, created by a family from Hoa Ma, just south of Hoan Kiem Lake, sold to migrants fleeing south during the communist takeover, then to the public at the first ever banh mi stand in 1958, in Saigon but named for that old Hanoi neighborhood. And there's one more thing that today is an essential part of Vietnamese culture that first took root here in Hanoi. And that, well, it might be the single biggest reason this city is always going 100 miles an hour. If Hanoi can feel overwhelming, the speed and the energy, well, there's one way to get yourself on the right level, to where this city starts to make sense. And that's to load up on a staggering amount of caffeine. The importance of coffee here in Vietnam goes back to the year 1888, when the first plantation was started in the hills on the outskirts of Hanoi. Since then, it's grown into a national obsession. Today, 3 million people in this country, one of every 15 in the workforce, make a living in the coffee trade. Farming, harvesting, drying, packing, trading, shipping, or opening cafes. Altogether creating an economy responsible for almost a tenth of the global coffee market. The signature drink is, of course, what we in the West call Vietnamese coffee. Here it's café sua, a triple shot of extremely strong drip mixed with sweet condensed milk. It's something found all across the country, but here it's not just a morning drink. It's a part of the culture, something consumed at any time in the day or even well into the evening, which sounds crazy except for two things. One, this is Hanoi and the city goes hard, and two, well, the local variations are endless, ranging from simple to completely off the wall with some closer to a meal than a drink. This is something that you just give, it's just like so uniquely, Vietnam to me. Coconut coffee, so it's basically 2 shots of espresso, one underneath the other poured on top of like a coconut milkshake. And it's fire, it's so good. If I had these every day, if I had access to this every day, I would have this morning, afternoon, and night, and I would be 200 kilos. But I'm starting to not care. Of all the creative styles of coffee identified with Hanoi, there's one that's achieved global fame. One that's become a major part of any trip to this city, and it's completely unlike anything else. It dates back to 1946, at the very beginning of the so-called First Indochina War, when a shipping blockade caused a shortage in fresh milk. Now, to that point, the local way of drinking coffee was in the classic French café au lait style, which makes sense as, of course, it was the French who introduced coffee in the first place. But without the main ingredient, this quickly turned into a breakfast crisis. Enter this man, Nguyen Van Giang, at the time a young bartender at the Hotel Metropole. Nguyen was tasked with finding some way to please his guests, and so, in a stroke of inspiration, he decided to make a sort of meringue, whipping eggs along with sweet condensed milk for a full 10 minutes, then pouring the mixture on top of a very strong cup of coffee, and thus was born a new phenomenon. By the time milk was back on Hanoi's shelves, it didn't matter. Egg coffee was now the local preference, and Nguyen would spend the rest of his life serving his creation at a cafe which is still a local landmark. But here, everyone knows that for the best version, the most authentic taste of the 1940s, you have to head to the banks of Hoan Kiem Lake to find a hidden entrance to a place called Cafe Din, a Hanoi institution owned and operated for 50 years by the daughter of Nguyen Van Thiang himself. It's like, I don't really know if I have good enough words to describe it. It's like a thick custard on top of strong espresso. It's sweet, but it's still coffee, and I'm gonna stop talking because if you keep filming, you're gonna watch me just get egg all over my face trying to take a sip. Ah, there's the coffee underneath. By the middle of the day, when the sun's beating down and you've reached your breaking point on noise and traffic and coffee, Hanoi always manages to come through with a perfect solution to throttle down, just in time, to step into a shaded alley and settle in for a plate of Bun Cha, the city's signature dish. In some ways, Bun Cha makes a perfect counterpart to the madness of the city. It's made up of so many different components that both making it and eating it requires patience. Since before the sunrise, the family behind this place, tucked away behind a house on Hang Quat, or the Street of Paper Fans, has divided up responsibilities, preparing the meat and cooking it over a charcoal fire, cleaning and picking herbs straight from the market, folding and frying spring rolls, dicing garlic and chili, and preparing the sauce that turns this whole thing into a cohesive dish. If everything else we've tried is the lifeblood of Hanoi, Bun Cha is the city's soul. Made famous abroad as a platform for Anthony Bourdain's conversation with Barack Obama, because Bun Cha isn't only about the meal, it's the experience of putting everything together like pieces of a puzzle, while slowing down, somehow finding zen or having a conversation in the middle of the old town. Bun Cha, if you don't know what this is, bun in Vietnamese means rice noodles. So it's these noodles, and you see they've used scissors, the classic ways to kind of cut them roughly into these little components, where you take the noodles and you dunk it into this broth, which isn't, I don't know if I'd call it a broth. It's a sauce. It's essentially a dipping sauce in the form of a soup. And let's just try that by itself. It's like, it almost tastes like apple cider vinegar. You know, it has that kind of, all the components of the fish sauce and the citrus and the meat stock kind of creates this really like almost appley broth when it's done right. With grilled pork, usually pork belly, and pork patties. Sometimes you'll see them wrapped in leaves. Here it's just the pork. We saw them cooking that. And then the lightly pickled carrots and radish, I think, you know, again, I'm not an expert in Vietnamese food, I just really like this stuff. All the fresh herbs, garlic, chili, and let's eat. That is unreal. Even with the noodles. I'm not even eating the pork, but in that broth, you can taste almost these like flecks of carbonized meats. It's so meaty, and just that you get the grilled taste front and center with every bite. Dennis, you're gonna love this. Try the pork.
There are places in the world where there's something, some indescribable magic in the air that can only be a product of a history, a culture so deeply rooted that none of us, except those born and raised here, could ever really begin to wrap our minds around it. But we can taste it, we can feel it. The method to the madness that somehow makes a city like this work, taking these overwhelming pieces and somehow bringing them together to make a whole, like assembling a bowl of Bun Cha. By the time we finished our meal, we were drained, exhausted, and as the caffeine began to wear off, we retreated to the hotel to lie down for a nap, planning to regroup 2 hours later to pick up where we left off. But while we were asleep, something happens between the hours of 2 and 4 in the afternoon every day in Hanoi that changes the city into something else, somehow unlocking one more level, one last great peak for a visitor to have to navigate to really do this city right. And that brings us to the reason I can only do Hanoi for 24 hours at a time. In 1858, the French took control of the new city of Saigon in Vietnam's Mekong Delta and set out to colonize the rest of the country. It would take another 30 years before they'd achieve their goal, finally planting their flag in Hanoi in the late 1880s. The local Hanoians never warmed to colonial rule, and the French largely kept to themselves, occupying a section of the fortified old city where they'd build a barracks, an armory, and the country's first ever brewery. To make their beer, they'd bring over a man named Alfred Hummel from Strasbourg on the German border, who'd been trained in the beer traditions of the Rhine River region. Under Hummel's leadership, his plant would produce about 150 liters of beer a day, just enough to supply the French aristocracy. Hummel Brewery would continue in this manner for 64 years, until the French were thrown out of the city in 1954, and the brewing tanks would be taken over by local residents, given the new name Bia Hoi Ha Noi. Now, this would not immediately catch on with the native population. Beer was seen as a symbol of the French, and the city still preferred to drink rice liquor. But that would change a decade later, when Hanoi found itself in the midst of one of the region's frequent rice shortages. Ho Chi Minh, at the time the leader of North Vietnam, declared consumption of rice liquor to be illegal. In his words, taking the staple grain to make alcohol while people were starving, akin to drinking the blood of one's own brothers. For Hanoi Brewery, they had a product that could fill the void. But there were still a couple obstacles that would need to be overcome. First, the cost of production for bottles made beer prohibitive for most local people, so Hanoi Brewery began instead only filling steel kegs, loading them every morning with an unpasteurized fresh lager of around 3.5% alcohol, a fast and efficient brewing process to create an affordable and mass-appealing product. And second, there was the issue of how residents would even drink the beer, as most people in those days didn't have glassware, just bowls or teacups. So the government commissioned a young engineer named Le Huy Van to find a solution. He came up with a half-liter tumbler made of fully recycled glass and with a dense, hard bottom meant to balance on the plastic stools found across Hanoi's streets. Le set up a makeshift factory in a village just to the south named Hoi Tri, where people who had been subsistence farmers began putting together more than 1,000 handmade glasses every day. They would be sold for 500 dong, just 2 cents US. And if a glass would break, its shards would be sent back to the village and recycled into more glasses. By the early 1970s, Bia Hoi, or fresh beer, had become a way of life for Hanoi's residents. No day could be complete without a few pints tossed down after a long day of work or even mid-shift. And when tourists started arriving after the end of the war, Bia Hoi would give the city its most iconic identity, with the first hostels and hotels opened around an intersection known as the Bia Hoi Corner.
In 1986, when Vietnam opened its economy and pulled back from the restrictions of communism, dozens of new breweries were set up to compete with Hanoi beer for the Bia Hoi market. But all this competition would do was keep the prices low. And even today, 60 years after the introduction of fresh beer, Hanoi is still widely considered by a huge margin the world's cheapest place to drink, with the average draft sold for maybe 20 cents, and yes, it's still served in those recycled glasses, still made by hand in Hoi Tri Village. Everyone in Hanoi has their local regular, their spot where they go to meet friends or read the newspaper or toss back a few dozen glasses of Bia Hoi. For me, well, mine's across the highway from the old quarter, somewhere that, just like the banh mi stand, I can't imagine a day without, and the only way to start an evening in the Vietnamese capital. So to me, Hanoi is Bia Hoi, and Bia Hoi. Our new friend Zoe. He's going to be our driver for the rest of the night, it's always a bad idea to hire a driver that you meet at a bar over beers, but that's fine. We are in the outskirts of the old city, so Bia Hoi is an old Hanoi tradition where it's fresh beer, so it's unpasteurized, made fresh every day, and they'll come around in the morning with trucks and fill up the tanks that you see. And it's light alcohol, it's like 2% probably, and it costs, so Zoe has just informed me that the price is going up. It's now 7,000 Vietnamese dong for one glass. It was 3,000 the first time I ever came to Hanoi, and I'm going to do a quick conversion. So in US dollars, this is 28 cents. So 4 of these for $1, and it's light, and the idea it's refreshing. It's slightly colder than room temperature, but that's the local culture. Is you sit outside and you have this, and in the old city it's become kind of touristy, and so that's the reason why, for me, you come to Hanoi and you just walk across the bridge, or you go outside the city and drink what the locals do, and so all of my best memories in Hanoi start with a Bia Hoi, and usually end with a Bia Hoi because I remember nothing about what comes next. Drinking Bia Hoi in an old-school Hanoi dive is one of those experiences where the whole is so much greater than the sum of the parts. I have no idea if the joy of sitting here in this atmosphere translates in any way to video, but I'm telling you, there's something so uniquely Hanoi about cheap beer served in recycled glasses, with the sound of motorcycles racing by, that this has to be up there with the best beer drinking circumstances anywhere, like a night of Guinness in an Irish pub. And just like anyone who's been to Dublin will tell you, it also leads to unpredictable decisions. Like in our case, deciding to get on the rickshaw of our new friend Zoe for our ride back to Old Town. Maybe not a choice our parents or insurance companies would encourage, but look, the guy's 65. He's been navigating these streets drunk on Bia Hoi for more than 4 decades. Maybe it's the alcohol talking, but today is not the day I die. You what?
Is the bike okay?
You and I are stressing the shock absorbers.
Yeah.
We're going the wrong way. I was looking at the map. I think we're going the wrong way. He says the lake is very beautiful. He wants to drive us around the lake and give us a small tour of the city before we go to the next beer location. And maneuvering around another bike. Yeah, so we're driving around the lake, the famous lake in Old Town, on the way to the next place to get a beer, and then we have dinner plans pretty soon. I'm gonna push that back because at our current speed, it'll take a while.
start to, just to show how long we've been on this bike.
We've been here. How long are we on?
The sun was up when we got off the bike. We have gone a total right now. Okay, so I know we did the loop around the lake. So far, we've been on the bike, if you just count starting point and where we are right now, 450 meters. And the sun is set. It's all right. I love this guy. I wouldn't. Oh. There's no better way to see the city, except. It's okay. Your bike okay?
Tomorrow morning 5 đến city.
Tomorrow morning 5 đến city.
Good map. Okay.
Thank you.
Không Hà Nội phone.
Okay. Bye bye.
Oh. Bye bye.
Okay. Bye bye. Nice to meet you. Thank you. We did have a plan for tonight. Since this was going to be our one and only video filmed in the city of Hanoi, the obvious idea was to go to dinner at the famous Cha Ca, the street specializing in that one dish of fish and turmeric, and it would have made a lot of sense for this story, but nothing makes sense after Bia Hoi. So instead I called an audible. I first met Chuck Turner almost 15 years ago when I had a restaurant in Beijing, and he was a local photographer and architect. He's a guy who has a habit of taking on outlandish projects and diving into the margins of wherever he might be, and since he's now at home in Hanoi, I asked if he knew any local places to find dinner, somewhere we'd have no hope of finding on our own. So that's how we found ourselves heading east to Long Bien District, one of the oldest parts of the city, the seat of power for some of those old kingdoms, and at one point, around 2,000 years ago, the greatest trading port in all of the Chinese Empire. And for our dinner, well, we're going to a place open for half a century, specializing in one thing and one thing only: water buffalo. Cooked in 1,000 different ways, and one more time, as tends to be a theme in Hanoi, I have no idea what I'm getting myself into. Well, this is something that I never thought that I would say in the history of this channel. This is Chuck Turner. This is a guy who I've known since I moved to Beijing a million years ago. In a very different context, certainly not from a food standpoint. Chuck was a photographer in Beijing a million years ago and lived in my neighborhood, and now he's living in this neighborhood. And when we got to Hanoi, I was like, well, who do I know in this city who can show us something that we would never have found without talking to somebody who lives here? And so I surprised Chuck at his cafe yesterday, and I said, okay, well, if you wanted to recommend one place for us to eat and film, what would it be? And you said...
It's got to be this.
It's so Chuck's business associates have taken him to dinner here. This place was opened in 1976. To show how long this has been a part of Hanoi's food scene, but it's not in the old city, so this is not a foreigner restaurant.
Correct.
What am I looking at? This is 4 kinds of meat. Are they different, or are they all something unique?
Water buffalo, water buffalo, water buffalo, and water buffalo.
And it's Hanoi, so bread.
Yep.
Really, this is all about the buffalo. So, Chuck, these are all dishes that you've had before here.
Correct?
Yeah.
All right, tell me what we have.
Okay.
To the best of your ability.
These are the ribs.
Yeah.
They're amazing. They fall right off the bone. This skillet is water buffalo in a skillet with an amazing sauce.
Okay.
This thing is really special. It's like dried water buffalo over roasted garlic. And then this is water buffalo with bamboo shoots.
I'm just slowly, as you point out each one, I'm just digging in.
The sauces?
Yep.
This sauce is best paired with this, but this is
With-
my favorite sauce, and I'll have it on everything.
With this.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna try this by itself first.
So this is like the kind of place where I guess you'd have business dinners, you'd have like family outings, you know. This is yeah?
Yep.
What was the line from Major League? That's why they called him the best in the business.
If you've never tasted water buffalo before, it's beef. A little leaner, maybe a tiny bit more gamey, but I mean, it's right in that same ballpark. Maybe the most interesting part of this meal was how similar the concept was to another place in town, somewhere we filmed our last video, the shoot that brought us to Hanoi in the first place. That one served only duck, but the general idea is the same, a modern restaurant concept following the principles of using all parts of an animal with nothing going to waste. It's not a coincidence that this establishment opened in 1976, at the end of not just the Vietnam War, but also the food shortage that led to the growth of Bia Hoi. Because when hunger is a way of life, even the best restaurants shouldn't waste anything. It would be disingenuous to tell a story about food in Hanoi without mentioning the fact that it's always been an issue here in the Red River Basin. The same characteristics that make this a great place for defense also mean it's not covered in wide open farmland. There was a famine here in the 1980s that led to the repeal of collective agriculture and the introduction of capitalism. Another one in the 40s caused as many as 2 million deaths, and we're still only mentioning the 20th century. Go back farther and you find a list of floods and droughts and farming disasters even longer than the list of wars and conquests, and that makes a huge impact on the food. Nobody grows up in Hanoi without understanding that food is something to be cherished, something of value and real importance. And given that necessity is the mother of invention, these struggles are probably the biggest reason for Hanoi's legendary flavors. In other cities, it's easy to build a cuisine around fresh ingredients, but here to make something taste great, you need to be creative. I mean, think about dishes like the old Bun Cuon, a sheet made of rice flour steamed and dipped into a sauce made of fermented fish with slices of sausage produced from cheap cuts of pork mixed with potato starch. Every single component is something invented to stretch limited supplies further. The toughness of Hanoi's people is on full display in the food. I mean, these are the people who kicked out the French and defeated the Ming Dynasty and stopped Genghis Khan's army 3 separate times. And even in living memory, there's been plenty of war. The War for Independence, the Vietnam War, and even into the 1980s there were still battles in the north, fending off an invasion from China. It's impossible for an outsider to have any concept of what it's really like to live in Hanoi, as the complicated history is everywhere. In 1976, when this restaurant first opened, meals like this were off limits to the average citizen. Vietnam was under strict communist law, and the people were assigned to collectives, and food was not something eaten at restaurants except by the ruling class, the high-ranking communist cadres. The tables here, or at the original location, would have been reserved only for the elite, off limits to mainstream Hanoi. Today, the clientele is very different. It's a measure of the resilience of this city that in barely more than a generation, this place, once the domain of the ruling class, is now best known as a meeting spot for the city's athletes, football players and bodybuilders, and on any given night, teams find their way here to take over the balcony and gorge on mountains of meat, chased down by Bia Hoi, and also rice liquor, which these days is again unrestricted. And now you can start to understand what we said at the very beginning. The reason every single day in Hanoi begins with a hangover.
And that is how I spent my day in Hanoi. This wild, overcrowded, unwelcoming gem of a drunken, caffeinated, charming, and delicious city that I'll never truly understand, except to know that I could come back here a dozen more times and still keep finding hidden secrets, 4,000 years of surprises, and when it comes to traveling, well, what more can you ask for than that? Subscribe to the channel for more from OTR. Thank you so much to everyone who supports us on Patreon. It really helps to keep us going. Find links below to our Patreon and social media, and we'll see you next week.
The last time I was in Hanoi was about 11 months ago when we came for the marathon. That was my first ever competitive running race, the Children's Fun Run, which I wish I was exaggerating, but like I signed up for the 5K and it turned out it was a children's 5K. People kept asking me like, where's your kid? Because everyone else was, there was like 2 other adults running and they were both like with their children, and I had to lie and be like, oh, he went to the bathroom. I did not win, but I came close, you know, against those kids. But this is just like, again, going for a 5-kilometer jog in this part of the city was just, it's so cool. Like, you know, it's such a cool place to walk around.